How General Langley's U-turn proved Traoré changed the game. First, the U.S. accused Burkina Faso's leader of stockpiling gold for personal power. Then, that same American general turned around and called him a visionary. So what made the West flip from attacking Captain Ibrahim Traoré to suddenly admiring him? What really happened behind the scenes that forced one of America's top generals to backpedal? Let's break it down. There wasn't a bombing, no military takeover, not even a classified leak. It all started with one calculated sentence. General Michael Langley, commander of U.S. Africa Command, leaned forward and spoke with the composed confidence of a man who thought he couldn't be challenged. Cameras were rolling. Langley accused Traoré, the transitional president of Burkina Faso, of using the country's gold reserves to strengthen military grip instead of supporting the people. He didn't stumble, he didn't hesitate. It was deliberate. The words were diplomatic on the surface, but hit like a direct insult. No proof, no background, no nuance. Just a bold claim that Traoré was hoarding national wealth to stay in power. And that's when the shockwave hit, not in Washington, but across Africa. The entire continent heard it for what it really was. Not just a critique, but a reminder of an old colonial mindset. A mindset that sees African leaders as needing correction. That respects control only when it benefits foreign markets. That treats African sovereignty as valid only if it aligns with Western expectations. But this wasn't the 1960s. This was 2025, and Africa wasn't going to stay silent. This was 2025, and this time, Africa didn't whisper. The backlash came loud, fast, and online. Within hours, General Langley's remarks spread like wildfire across social media, translated into French, Arabic, Swahili, and countless local tongues. It wasn't just a soundbite anymore. It had become a spark. Influencers, journalists, and political voices from every corner of the continent began dissecting the statement. Was the gold not Burkina Faso's to manage? Didn't the country have every sovereign right to nationalize its own resources? And what gave a foreign general, seated thousands of miles away, the authority to challenge it? Then came the headlines, and they weren't limited to Africa. Across the global south, the framing was clear. This wasn't just another press statement, it was an attack. Langley's words were viewed as another example of Western powers undermining African self-determination. Commentators in countries like Mali, Ghana, Senegal, and the DRC drew direct lines between Langley's tone and decades of foreign interference cloaked in diplomatic jargon. They said this was no accident. It was the same old condescension, dressed in new language. And what made it worse? Burkina Faso had already been in the spotlight the year before. It had kicked out foreign troops, reclaimed control over its gold sector, and begun organizing a Pan-African alliance rooted in self-reliance. Captain Traoré wasn't just a leader anymore. He had become a symbol, young, military-trained, confident, and unapologetically Pan-African. So Langley's insult wasn't taken lightly. It wasn't just personal, it was ideological, and the backlash came like a wave. In Ouagadougou, young demonstrators took to the streets. Their signs read, "Hands off our gold," and "Langley, who owns Africa?" But the outrage didn't stop at the border. In Mali, artists painted vivid murals of Traoré crushing colonial puppets. In Chad, students held academic panels breaking down Langley's words as a textbook example of neocolonial rhetoric. Even those who had long opposed Traoré's military-led leadership found themselves defending him. Because this time, the insult came from outside. And that changed everything. The controversy achieved something rare. It united political rivals, if only temporarily, under a shared cause: dignity. But this wasn't just theater. It wasn't just about chants and placards. Behind closed doors, African diplomats began sending direct and deliberate messages to U.S. embassies. Sources reported that back-channel meetings took place in multiple capitals. In those rooms, the message was simple but firm. General Langley needed to walk it back. Some ministers reportedly threatened to boycott upcoming regional security discussions if there wasn't some form of correction. Quiet frustration had turned into coordinated pressure. By the end of the month, the story had completely flipped. Langley, once hailed in U.S. media as an expert on Africa, had become the face of everything Africans resented about foreign influence. He was now seen as a symbol of Western arrogance, tone-deaf, outdated, and out of touch. Meanwhile, Captain Traoré remained silent. But that silence wasn't emptiness, it was strategy. He didn't need to respond. The people, the streets, and the headlines had already answered for him. Without lifting a finger, Traoré had won the messaging war. What started as a jab meant to humiliate him had instead elevated his status. He was no longer just a transitional leader. He was now viewed by many as a champion of African pride and sovereignty. Langley, whether he knew it or not, had poured fuel onto a fire already burning across the continent. But behind every public blow-up, there are private calculations. And pressure on Langley didn't just come from abroad. It started to grow within his own circles, inside the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House. Because once a storm of this scale begins, someone always has to clean it up. And that's where the narrative shifts. Soft break for transition. By now, Langley's name wasn't just trending. It had become a punchline in African political circles. To many, he embodied the exact arrogance they were fighting to escape. But while the protests made headlines, what mattered more was what wasn't being said out loud. Regional leaders stopped taking U.S. calls. Intelligence partnerships were put on hold. Invitations to military summits were rescinded without explanation. And quietly, U.S. diplomats began sending urgent reports back to Washington. They warned of a diplomatic freeze spreading across West Africa. The message was clear. U.S. engagement in the Sahel was facing resistance, not because of a change in policy, but because of a change in tone. Langley's words hadn't just offended, they had backfired. And now, the West was learning that Africa wasn't just listening anymore, it was responding. Langley hadn't just offended Burkina Faso. He had pushed away an entire region already questioning American influence. Insiders say his own team urged him to take action, and not the usual quiet diplomacy wrapped in careful language. They called for something bolder, a direct, public reversal. Because this wasn't just about headlines, this was about perception and power. Langley, a man shaped by battlefields, strategy maps, and structured command chains, now found himself defeated, not by armies, but by a rising wave of African assertiveness. He hadn't miscalculated a geographic position, he had misjudged the moment. The pressure didn't only come from African specialists either. National security experts inside Washington were alarmed too. They watched as China and Russia gained ground diplomatically across Africa, without ever uttering a word about Burkina Faso's gold policies. That silence wasn't weakness. It was calculated restraint. While the U.S. criticized, China and Russia remained quiet, letting African nations reclaim control without fear of interference. Meanwhile, Langley had charged into the situation swinging, and now Washington had a diplomatic mess to fix. The general finally backed down. A formal statement was written. Insiders say it was edited several times, each revision softer, more careful, trying to apologize without appearing defeated. Eventually, it was released. Langley admitted that his earlier remarks lacked context, that external factors had shaped his judgment. To many, it read as routine damage control. But in Africa, it landed differently. This wasn't seen as clarification. It was seen as a retreat. A continent long treated as a strategic pawn had just compelled one of America's highest-ranking generals to backtrack publicly. And analysts noticed. They didn't see a fall of American military might, but a shift in how Africa responds to foreign criticism. The message was clear. Accusations would no longer be swallowed. Africa was standing up, not with outrage, but with a demand for respect or silence. And so, Langley's retreat became symbolic. The very climb down he had hoped to avoid became his lasting image: surrender. But saying sorry is one thing. Rebuilding trust is another. Washington understood this. They couldn't just issue a statement and move on. The backlash had real weight. If they didn't act fast, they risked losing the trust of Burkina Faso and possibly the entire Sahel region. Then something unexpected happened. Langley didn't stop at an apology. He began to compliment. The same man who had once painted Traoré as dangerous now called him bold, visionary, and forward-looking. Observers were left wondering, had America truly changed its tune, or had it simply chosen a new mask? Langley praised Traoré's efforts toward national development and economic independence. But here's the twist. Traoré hadn't changed at all. Langley said, there were no elections, no reforms to appease the West, no softened position from the Burkinabe government. It was America that blinked, and Africa knew it. If anything, Traoré had become even more defiant. He tightened his grip on the economy, brought key institutions firmly under state control, and doubled down on nationalizing gold, energy, and agriculture. Instead of stepping toward the Western economic model, he was walking away from it entirely. Yet somehow Langley's tone shifted overnight, like a weather vane spinning in chaos. To seasoned analysts, this wasn't admiration, it was strategy. Langley hadn't suddenly embraced Traoré's vision. He had recognized a shifting landscape. And on that new geopolitical map, Burkina Faso was no longer a marginal player. It had become a statement. Here was a country facing sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and media attacks, and not only surviving, but creating a new system that rejected Western influence at every level. In effect, Traoré had grown too influential to ignore. Langley's sudden about-face wasn't a personal revelation. It reflected a wider wake-up call spreading across U.S. foreign policy circles. The old tools, military funding, conditional loans, and IMF requirements were losing their grip in places that had tasted sovereignty and refused to let go. And as the West stepped back, others stepped in. Russia deepened military cooperation. China expanded trade routes, digital infrastructure, and investment without the lectures. Turkey and Iran pursued cultural and tech partnerships. Even smaller nations like Serbia and Indonesia opened fresh diplomatic channels across West Africa. The West wasn't just losing its voice, it was losing its seat at the table. That's why Langley's shift mattered. This wasn't only about Traoré, it was a last-ditch attempt to hold on to influence before it evaporated completely. By suddenly praising Traoré, the US tried to send a message. We're adaptable. We can work with your kind of leadership. We're listening now. We respect your autonomy, but the timing made it hard to believe. Everyone remembered the smear campaign, the public scolding, the tone of superiority, so when the praise came, it didn't feel genuine. It felt like panic. Burkina Faso's government kept its cool. There were no celebration tweets, no photo ops with US officials, no speeches about reconciliation. Instead, the country pressed forward, investing more in local industries, boosting military ties with non-Western partners, and firmly declaring that Burkina Faso would continue down its own path. And in that silence, Traoré made his stance clear. He didn't need external validation. He had already won. But Langley's pivot sent shockwaves far beyond Ouagadougou. In capitals across Africa, especially in Mali, Guinea, and Nigeria, leaders took notice. The pattern was becoming obvious. First, they attack. Then, you resist. And if you stand your ground, they back off, and even offer respect. It was no longer just a story. It was a playbook. Stand tall, and the empire will kneel. In elite diplomatic circles, Traoré's name became more than a symbol. It became a shield, a diplomatic force field. Criticizing him was no longer a simple tactic. It now risked triggering a backlash not just from Burkina Faso, but from an entire continent watching with pride and solidarity. Langley's retreat wasn't just personal, it marked a shift in global power balance. It signaled that the age of one-sided diplomacy was crumbling, that African nations, when led by self-interest and unity, could flip the script, not just defend their ground, but force the West to rethink its approach. Still, one question lingered. Was Langley's praise genuine, or was it just the next move in a long, calculated strategy to contain the rise of independent African powers? Because in international relations, flattery is rarely innocent. Sometimes it's camouflage, and maybe, just maybe, this was the mask Washington needed to stay in the game, now that Africa was no longer quiet, compliant, or invisible. General Langley's sudden praise of Traoré wasn't some isolated diplomatic gesture. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso or a slip-up at a Senate hearing. It was a sign, one pointing to something much bigger, a shift that revealed how shaky America's influence in Africa had become. Because while Langley offered compliments in public, real concern was spreading behind closed doors. The uncomfortable truth in Washington is this: the U.S. is no longer the automatic power in Africa, and American policymakers know it. For decades, U.S. dominance on the continent was held up by three pillars: military partnerships, foreign aid, and global diplomatic reputation. That model relied on the belief that Africa needed the West more than the West needed Africa. But that formula is breaking down. And perhaps the hardest thing for Washington to accept is that this shift didn't come from rebellion or war. It came from independent decisions. Across the Sahel and beyond, African leaders have stopped instinctively turning to the West. They're looking elsewhere, to the East, to the global South, and sometimes inward. New alliances are taking shape with countries like Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, India, Brazil, even unexpected partners like Malaysia and Indonesia. And unlike Western nations, these new allies don't demand reforms. They don't preach. They don't wrap their deals in lectures or moral superiority. That's the part Washington is quietly scrambling to confront. Langley's polite words masked something deeper: fear. What if the U.S. simply doesn't matter as much anymore? Russia, for instance, is embedding itself into African defense systems, not just with arms deals and handshakes, but with real military training, security arrangements, and boots-on-the-ground partnerships. And they do it without conditions. They ask what's needed and deliver, earning a kind of trust the U.S. rarely receives. China takes a different route: economics. It's building railways, ports, power grids, and digital networks, financed, built, and maintained through simple deals. No public criticism, no moral scorecards, no strings. China treats African governments like partners, not projects. And smaller emerging powers? They're doing the same, quietly and effectively. The Gulf nations are pouring resources into African farming and supply chains. India is rolling out digital healthcare initiatives. Brazil is forming academic and research alliances. Each of these countries is offering something the United States has struggled to deliver: a partnership grounded in shared interests, not historical baggage. Meanwhile, America seems caught between two conflicting instincts. On one side, it wants to show itself as a respectful partner that honors sovereignty. On the other, it clings to old habits, the instinct to dictate terms, to lead from a pedestal. Langley's original attack on Traoré revealed this contradiction plainly. For a moment, the mask slipped, and the old voice of control re-emerged. When the backlash came hard and fast, the playbook shifted. But it was too late. Africa had already noticed. The world had noticed. Even within American policy circles, whispers grew louder. Think tanks began to admit the obvious: the U.S. no longer holds exclusive influence in Africa. Military installations no longer guarantee political loyalty. Aid doesn't translate into control. And criticism? It invites resistance, not obedience. This brings us back to Langley's image makeover. It wasn't just damage control, it was a test run. A test to see whether America could stay relevant in an Africa that is no longer dominated by one voice? Early signs suggest that answer is no. As Langley praised Burkina Faso's progress, Traoré was sealing deals with non-Western powers. They discussed refining gold, boosting food independence, and constructing shared infrastructure. While U.S. officials tried to mend diplomatic fences, Burkina Faso's youth gathered in cultural festivals celebrating Pan-African unity and breaking away from institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Africa wasn't waiting for validation. It was already on the move. Langley's praise didn't lure Burkina Faso back into the Western camp. It simply confirmed a shift that had already taken place. The U.S. could no longer command respect. It had to earn it and compete for it. And that meant standing shoulder to shoulder with powers that respected African direction, even when it diverged from Western priorities. This isn't just about Burkina Faso or West Africa. It signals a seismic change in global politics. Burkina Faso, once seen as marginal, now stands as an example of defiance and independence. And Traoré, by holding his ground, has become a beacon for other African leaders ready to reject foreign micromanagement. The unipolar world is fading. Africa, once reduced to a board for great power games, is now a player in its own right, setting its rules, building new alliances, and moving with new confidence. The only question is, will the West accept this evolution or continue acting as if the old order still exists? Because the real shift came not from a speech or summit, but from a single image, a U.S. general apologizing to a young African leader, and then almost immediately praising him. To some, it looked like diplomacy. To others, it looked like panic in disguise. To a rising wave of African leaders, thinkers, and change-makers, this didn't feel like just another political gesture. It felt like long overdue recognition of who truly holds the reins now. Let's be clear, General Langley didn't lose his title. He wasn't publicly reprimanded or removed, but he did something more significant. He offered a rhetorical bow to a man the West had tried to undermine. And in that subtle turn from confrontation to admiration, something deeper was exposed. A shift in the global current, one that confirmed Africa is no longer waiting for guidance. It's charting its own path, and the world is adjusting to that. What's quietly causing anxiety in places like Washington and Brussels isn't simply one government's decision to nationalize gold. It's the dawning realization that Africa doesn't feel compelled to justify itself anymore. It doesn't need permission to control its own resources. It doesn't need approval to align militarily with non-Western nations. And it certainly doesn't need to mirror Western democratic structures to validate its sovereignty. In fact, many African governments are now asking a deeper question. Why follow models that don't serve them? In Burkina Faso, Traoré has shown what happens when a country governs on its terms and stays standing. Western analysts predicted collapse when gold was nationalized. It didn't happen. They foresaw turmoil after power was centralized. Instead, public support for Traoré soared. They warned the country would be diplomatically shunned. Instead, new alliances began forming in unexpected corners. And now, the same powers that once cautioned against this model are re-entering the conversation. This time, with forced smiles and calculated praise. But that praise isn't universal. Behind closed doors, many Western institutions are beginning to panic. Not because their ideas were defeated, but because they're being sidelined. African nations are building new alliances, launching regional currencies, and hosting peace negotiations without Western mediation. There's no need for a formal declaration of separation. The shift is visible in their behavior. You can hear it in the new language being used by African leaders: partnership over aid, sovereignty over conditions, collaboration over compliance. You can see it in who travels to meet whom. Where once African presidents boarded planes to Europe for pledges, today European officials are flying to Africa, hoping to keep up. And increasingly they're leaving with empty promises, not influence. The transformation is emotional as well. There's a resurgence of pride, a cultural awakening, a shared belief that the continent's future lies not in patching old Western systems, but in designing its own. From finance to education, from national security to media, Africa is testing new models. Some will fail, but others will redraw the map. The key is this: Africa is moving forward without asking for a green light. So when Langley praised Traoré, it wasn't just diplomacy, it was a silent admission. The West no longer sets the terms. It must now pay attention, or be left behind. That creates a new kind of uncertainty. What happens when the West loses control of the African narrative? When it can no longer weaponize aid, manipulate the message, or dictate progress? That moment is already here, and it's making Africa stronger. What's your take? Should Africa embrace full sovereignty, even if it means rejecting Western aid? Would that be a better path? Let us know in the comments what future you want for the continent. If you want more videos like this, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay inspired.